Hi, welcome to A Film Darkly. I'm your host, Anthony Pacino, and in this episode, I'm going to be discussing the film's Doctor Strange. If you haven't seen the movie, you will want to see it before this, because I will go over some spoilers, but I'm mostly going to be talking about the concept within the film of an existentialist becoming a Platonist by essentially going through the allegory of the cave, which was an allegory written by Plato. And in this allegory, Plato had if you know anything about Plato has this idea of the forms, meaning that there are particular truths out there. So there could be a billion different types of chairs, but there's one ultimate form that is a chair. And that chair is an ultimate truth, basically stating that truth of a chair does exist in this ultimate form. And outside of that would be close to it, but not the exact thing. And Plato's picture of the allegory of the cave, which I feel this is important to go over before I get into the film, is essentially imagine that you have a cave and you have these individuals sort of propped down, sitting, or maybe even chained up. I think actually they are chained up at the bottom of in this cave. They're facing the back wall, and behind them is the cave is a little raised up, and there are these objects being placed up on a wall, so to speak, and a fire is behind them, and the shadows are being cast on the back wall. And so the individual who's chained up is representing the normal self, the regular person, the average individual living on the streets. You're living a same routine life. Sort of like in the Groundhog Day podcast, I talked about how individuals live their routine life, and you never really break that routine. These individuals would be the chained people. They're the people who are chained up at the bottom of the cave, constantly having to look at nothing but shadows of the truth, shadows of what things are. And that is their depiction of truth. Is it actual truth, though? No. Actual truth would be to escape the cave and to emerge out of it, recognizing that you are only seeing the shadows of objects, but not the objects themselves. And when you are to escape the cave, you are to enter into the world of the forms, which is the ultimate truth. And this is kind of the case with Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange, or Stephen Strange, is a complete existentialist. He's this really cocky, arrogant doctor who's a surgeon who's actually really, really good. He's the best at his job. And we're following him through this adventure when, he has this tragic accident and his hands are completely shattered, completely broken. And everything they try to do for his hands, they just don't come out right. They're scarred. They can't work correctly. He can't hardly move them right without fidgeting too much. And he's just in a mess. And he needs his hands to conduct surgery. He can't do it without his hands, obviously. You can't hardly eat without your hands. There's a lot of things you cannot do without hands. It's what makes hands so important. Which is interesting because we oftentimes are more concerned about our heart, more concerned about our other organs and such, rather than being real concentrating on our hands. And yet, what good is your heart if your hands can't work? What good is certain parts of your body if you don't? What good is being? What good is it to be focused on these things that would basically bring on death if you're in some way missing something else? Like, for instance, your hand is useless without its thumb. You can only do so much without a thumb. And, I used to have actually I used to know someone who would always say, you're only as strong as your thumb. And he used to do martial arts, and he would ask you to try and grab him. And when you grabbed his wrist, he could always break it by putting pressure, break your grip by putting pressure against your thumb. And he always just said, you're only as strong as your thumb. And I always thought that was really, really interesting. But it's true. And your thumb is essential. So it's this idea that, you lose one part of your body and you sort of lose the whole thing. You're a well-oiled machine, so to speak, and every bit and piece of you, every part of you is necessary for the machine to operate correctly. And if any one of those parts aren't operating correctly, the whole machine can go down, and you end up crippled, or you end up in these in this way where you can't operate correctly. So that's where Strange is at. Now, Strange makes himself very well known to be an existentialist. And if you don't know what an existentialist is an individual who essentially believes that everything is through them, that they are the free, responsible agent and determining their own development through acts of the will, if that makes sense. So it's sort of like, it's to put it very, I don't know if the word would be harsh here, because I don't mean to be harsh about it, but existentialism is literally, it's sort of a selfishness. It's the idea that everything sort of boils down to you, to your intellect, to how you belong in the world. Existentialists tend to be atheists. They tend to be the kind of people who don't believe in God. They don't believe in anything outside of what they see. They don't believe in anything outside of scientists, outside of science. And that tends to be how they think and how they work. And so everything for them is very practical and very real. And anything that is outside of that doesn't work. So here you have Strange, who has this weird thing happen to him. And he's trying everything he can, doing as much research as possible, just to figure out if there's some method he hasn't seen to fix his hands. Some doctor or something. He obviously is arrogant enough to think he could have fixed his own hands. He actually says he knows he could have done better on himself. Unfortunately, he's incapable of doing so. He can only teach other people to do what he thinks is the right thing to do, and he can't even necessarily depend on them, because they're not him. They don't have his skill. So this is the idea here, is that, he's trying to find a way out. And he finds out about a gentleman who I cannot remember the name of at this moment, that had gone through a rehab, and he had actually been crippled with his spine and everything, and was now able to walk. And this rehab, this guy who's helping him in rehab, helping Strange, tells him about this individual. And so Strange seeks him out, and the guy tells him that he basically went to India, and he talked to people from this one particular part of the region of the world that I cannot pronounce for the life of me, so I'm not going to try. And he learned from mystics. And so obviously Strange doesn't believe this. He thinks there's something practical to their practices. So he actually goes and he seeks them out, and he finds them, and then he meets Tilda Swinton's character, the Ancient One. And they're having this little conversation, and he's kind of like in disbelief, and he's like, am I in like basically one of these shops where, gift shops where I see all these weird little, trinkets and stuff that, and if you know anything about this, you know what he means. You can go into these stores where they just have like all these little trinkets and stuff that are all attached to spirituality in some way. And so he's basically just kind of throwing that out there. And the Ancient One, so we're going to start going into some of the quotes, and it's mostly between him and the Ancient One. That's where everything is said, between those two. That gives us a peek into what Doctor Strange is all about, the film that is. And so the Ancient One at one point tells him, "You're a man looking at the world through a keyhole. You've spent your whole life trying to widen that keyhole, to see more, to know more. And now, on hearing that it can be widened in ways you can't imagine, you reject the possibility." Because she's telling him about the soul, and she's telling him about how your physical body is related and reflect and is the same as your soul. And Strange says, "No, I reject it because I do not believe in fairy tales about chakras or energy or the power of belief. There is no such thing as spirit. We are made of matter and nothing more. You're just another tiny momentary speck within an indifferent universe." Spoken like a true skeptic. A true skeptic, and let's be honest, a true atheist. That's exactly how they like to talk. You listen to a guy like Michael Shermer, and that's what he's going to tell you. You listen to a person like Richard Dawkins, that's what he's going to tell you. You see this kind of talk all the time. I don't believe in none of that stuff. None of that stuff exists. None of that's real. Come on. So the Ancient One essentially gives him this little tiny speech and then tells him to open his eye. And she puts her thumb right against his forehead and pushes. And this is after she has hit him in the chest and forced his astral projection out of his body, his soul, to remove from his body. And he's like, "What happened?" And she's like, "I pushed your astral form out of your body." And she's like, "You need to," and he's like, "Is there LSD in my tea?" and all this stuff. And just, you're trying to look for some practical explanation. So she gives him the most impractical explanation of all. She touches his forehead and says, "Open your eye." Now, the reason she says that is because she's referring to the pineal gland that is found in the brain, and it's located pretty much right in the center of your forehead, where you would have a third eye, so to speak, and people refer to it as the third eye. And it's a mysterious little thing. It's something people think, produces DMT is the acronym used for this really complicated word that no matter how many times I hear it, I cannot possibly recite it correctly. And so some people believe it's the link to the spiritual. And I'm not here to say whether it is or isn't. That's up to you guys. But the point is that she touches him here and she pushes back. And so obviously the people who wrote Doctor Strange knew a lot about this sort of stuff, the psychedelics and the pineal gland and all that stuff that Joe Rogan likes talking about, and a lot of the people within the same circle that he works within. And Strange is sent into dimensions in the multiverse, and he's just kind of like flying around. It's this really trippy sequence that I can only imagine what it's like if you're on some psychedelic. And during this time, the Ancient One's talking to him. The Ancient One says, "You think you know how the world works? You think that this material universe is all there is? What is real? What mysteries lie beyond the reach of your senses? At the root of existence, mind and matter meet. Thoughts shape reality. This universe is only one of an infinite number. Worlds without end. Some benevolent and life-giving, others filled with malice and hunger. Dark places where powers older than time lie ravenous and waiting. Who are you in this vast multiverse, Mr. Strange?" So what has happened to Strange at this point is he has had somebody walk into the cave and free him. And now what this individual has done, or I shouldn't say freed him, but suppose that an individual were to go into the cave and were able to give you a peek at the world of the forms, at the real world around him. Not the world he's used to that is made up of the shadow, but a world beyond that, not fixated within his routine. And that's what happened here. The Ancient One gave him a peek. So after that, Strange is hungry for that peek. He's hungry for what he saw. He's like, wait, that's truth. And that's the thing that has to be really said about guys like Shermer and Dawkins and people who we view as skeptics, and some people really make fun of them and other people view them as heroes. However you want to see them. The one thing you have to accept, everyone should accept as across the board, is these are people who are wanting truth. And they, like anyone else, are seeking it in their own way. And sometimes they just don't see the evidence that you're trying to present them that may be otherwise. But it doesn't mean that they're not seekers. I mean, that's the one thing you got to give a skeptic credit for, is that they're skeptical when everyone else is believing. And that's called an individual that is an individual who's willing to be critical, who's willing to think outside the box, and is not willing to just say, I believe because you guys all believe. And that is a credit that someone must give to these people. So imagine if you were to go to an individual like that, like Dawkins or Shermer, like I mentioned earlier, Daniel Dennett, or I would mention Sam Harris, but he's a little different now. But even Harris would be a good example. Imagine you go to these people and you give them a peek of, I don't know, say heaven. You give them a peek of heaven. Well, of course they're going to be hungry to know what more that is. They're going to want to seek it. They're going to want to know more about it because they've been given the peek. So that's what happens to Strange. All of a sudden he's given the peek of the forms, and now he needs to know the forms. So there's this part where he's talking to the Ancient One, and the Ancient One kind of makes things more practical for him. And she says, the language of the mystic arts is as old as civilization. The sorcerers of antiquity called the use of this language spells. But if that word offends your modern sensibilities, I like that because she's essentially saying, I know you're a skeptic, so if I use the word angel, or I use the word God, or I use the word miracle, or in this case, spells, it's going to offend you. So if that word offends your modern sensibilities, you can call it a program. The source code that shapes reality. That is such a great way of saying it, because what the Ancient One's doing now is she's giving him the peek, and now she's breaking the chains and trying to assist him to get out of the cave. And by doing so, she's showing him the practicality of the forms. It's not impractical. So it's similarly to like taking a skeptic like Michael Shermer and saying, hey, Michael, check this out. Michael says, whoa, crap, what was that? And now you have to prepare him for it. And you say, there's a world of miracles. And he goes, oh, come on, miracles. And you say, well, if it offends your modern sensibility, look at it more as the supernatural. Ah, the supernatural. Okay, if that offends your modern sensibilities, let's just say something we don't scientifically understand yet. Oh, okay. Okay, so you're saying science can understand it. Possibly, eventually, maybe. That's a big if. But this is something that is practical. So she uses a good practical word for spells like program. The source code that shapes reality, so to speak. And this makes it practical for him. So now he's starting to understand. You're talking in the shadow language for him in order for him to understand the forms. Eventually he'll get that calling it something like that could work, but it's a little beyond that. But you can't just force him into it. So then there's this whole part where she's trying to help him. They're trying to help him with his little ring that he has that can form these little wormholes that are transportation. So it's with a sling ring, I think it's called. and they could form these little holes in the sky or wherever, and then they could jump through them and end up in another place. And all they have to do is imagine where they want to go. And so it's a way of teleporting through this sort of wormhole. And she's talking to him, and he's frustrated. He's frustrated because he can't do it because of his stupid hands. And she has this one master show him you don't need hands, because he's actually missing a hand to do this. So this power doesn't work in that way where you need to have your physical hands, because your physicality has nothing to do with it. And she says something interesting here. She tells him, you cannot beat a river into submission. You have to surrender to its current and use its power as your own. And Strange, speaking like a true skeptic, says, I control it by surrendering control? That doesn't make any sense. And the Ancient One says something that is probably the most religious thing an individual can say that no skeptic would truly accept. But it's interesting because she says, not everything does, not everything has to. And that's something that's really hard for someone to take, especially if you're a skeptic. Someone who's very practical. Because it's like, he just finished pointing out how illogical your statement was about beating a river. You can't beat a river into submission. You have to submit to it in order to control it. How do you submit to something to control it? And now she's saying not everything has to make sense. Not everything does. Not everything has to make sense. But then she goes on, and this is where she makes a great point. She says, your intellect has taken you far in life, but it will take you no further. Surrender, Stephen. Silence your ego, and your power will rise. The biggest issue with an existentialist or a skeptic like that of Michael Shermer, and I use him because he actually has a magazine called Skeptic Magazine. The thing about individuals like that is most often than not, if they cannot wrap their mind around something, they will not accept it. That is part of their paradigm. The paradigm of the skeptic is, if you cannot explain it to me, I don't accept what you're saying. You can say blessings and angel all the day long, but unless you can explain to me in practical terminology why that works, I will not wrap my mind around it. I can't. Going back to the offending your modern sensibilities. You offend the modern sensibilities, so he can't wrap his mind around it. And I know what you're thinking. At least I hope you're seeing what I'm seeing. That's limiting. It's incredibly limiting. This is why the Ancient One says your intellect has only taken you as far as taken you far in life, but it can't take you no further. You have to surrender. Silence your ego, and your power will rise. Silence that part of you. That part of you that wants so badly to understand. Because understanding isn't everything. There's some things we don't get. And when a person is willing to make their own hypothesis and come to their own conclusions about those things, and it works, why in the world would you bag on them for it? And maybe you should learn something from them and ask yourself, am I limiting myself? Now, there's this whole scene near the end of the movie when the Ancient One has basically fallen a really long way and she's hit the ground and she's dying. And while she's dying, she pulls out of her body in an astral projection, and Strange pulls out of his and follows her. And they have this really neat conversation because they're watching it snow. And they're watching like everything in slow motion. Everything's in very slow motion in the astral world. And Ancient One's about ready to die, her physical body, but here's her spirit. And she's talking to Strange, and she says, I've spent so many years peering through time, looking at this exact moment, but I can't see past it. I've prevented countless terrible futures, and after each one there's always another, and they all lead here, but never further. And Strange says, you think this is where you die? She says, you wonder what I see in your future? And he says no, and then he's like, yes. And then she goes, I never saw your future, only its possibilities. You have such a capacity for goodness. You've always excelled. But not because you crave success, but because you fear your fear of failure. He fears failure, as do many of us. Many of us. And then Strange says, it's what made me a great doctor. So what made him a great doctor was his fear of failure. And that's interesting because it's not to say that that isn't a good motivator. It is. We all have a motivation like that to some extent. Granted, I think some people are happy in the chains and watching the shadows, and some people want to probably snuggle up with the chains and wrap themselves a little further in the chains. I mean, you see it all the time. If you're the kind of person listening to this and you like hearing me talk about this stuff, then you are more than likely not part of the average. The average individuals don't like this kind of stuff because this kind of stuff challenges things they come to accept as normal. They're happy looking at the shadows. But fear of failure can be a great motivator. And Strange is saying it has. But see, the Ancient One cracks that open and says, it's precisely what's kept you from greatness. Arrogance and fear still keep you from learning the simplest and most significant lesson of all. You ready for this? Strange says, which is? I really hope you're ready for this. It's not about you. Now, that's an interesting statement, isn't it? It's not about you. Think back to Groundhog Day. That's the world of the forms. Strange, after this, enters into the world of the forms. He finally gets it. It's never been about you. And that's the issue with existentialism. It's all about you. That's the problem with this extreme skepticism. It's all about you. You trying to wrap your mind around everything. And if you can't wrap your mind around it, it's not worth looking at because it's all about you. If I don't get it, then it doesn't exist. Oh, excuse me. Over 2.5 billion worldwide are Christian, and then over, I don't know how many billion of every other religion under that. Millions of people believe in these things that we all think are, that some of us, or I shouldn't say we, but some people in this world think are absolutely goofy. I've talked to those people, lots of skeptics, and you listen to a guy like Michael Shermer, and he'll sit there and he will be skeptic about every single one of these things. Yet millions of people say, I see it. Now, does that make it true? No. That doesn't make it true. This isn't about telling somebody you need to accept religion, or you need to accept chakra, or you need to accept some other thing. I don't know, whatever it is. It's not even saying that somebody who says the earth is flat is absolutely right, and you have to grasp that and say, yes, it's true, I believe it. Even though my intellect and the pictures and everything else says otherwise, I believe it. No. All this is saying is you have to open your mind. Being an existentialist essentially is like being a master of the shadows. You just realize that there's a fire casting the shadow when no one else does. And that's great. That's excellent. But it's not out of the cave. Being out of the cave is to recognize more. And this whole concept of it not being about you, but about the other, is the greatest concept of all. Because it breaks you free of you. One of the things the Ancient One says that I think is a fantastic line right before she dies is she says, Strange tells her, Strange tells her, I'm not ready. And the Ancient One responds, no one ever is. We don't get to choose our time. Death is what gives life meaning. To know your days are numbered, your time is short. You'd think after all this time I'd be ready. But look at me, stretching one moment out into 1,000 just so I can watch the snow. Even the Ancient One, with all her power and all her knowledge, fears death. It's interesting. It's fascinating, to say the least. So that's the point of all this, of this story. It's what makes the Doctor Strange film a great film. Is it shows you the meaning of what it is to emerge from the cave, of what it is not to be an existentialist. Somebody who just is kind of focused more on them than anyone else. It doesn't necessarily mean that's what an existentialist is per se, completely. There are plenty of people, I'm sure, that are existentialists, but are also good people. You know, they do for others. They help others. I certainly know many people who are atheists and are great people. It doesn't make you not a great person to not believe in God or something. It doesn't mean that you're instantly terrible. If you look back at my Joker podcast, you may have to ask yourself whether it's consistent. But you can't necessarily just say, oh, hey, you can't be a good person because you're an atheist or you're a skeptic. Let's not even leave it at atheist. Let's just say skeptic. The point is, though, is that as an existentialist, as somebody who thinks that it's only about your mind, your ego, what you can wrap your mind around, really in the end is limiting you. You have to be open. Whether you like it or not, faith has to be part of your vocabulary. And if that offends your modern sensibilities, don't call it faith. Call it a hypothesis. So that's going to do it for me, guys. I hope you enjoy this podcast as much as I enjoy doing these podcasts. So don't forget to like, share, subscribe from wherever you're listening, whether that be SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spreaker, YouTube, Minds.com, which I keep forgetting to mention. But just don't forget to do those things. So until next time, goodbye.